All right, hello everyone and welcome to today's Dynamics 365 Tech Talk. Today's topic is Introduction to the Batch Retriable feature. My name is Erin and I'll be your moderator today. We are broadcasting this session through Teams live events and the audio can be heard through your device speakers. The session is being recorded on behalf of the Microsoft Corporation. When you join this event, your name, email address, and/or phone number may be viewable by other session participants in the attendee list. By joining, you are agreeing to this experience. The recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. If you have questions for the presenters or need support, please use the Q&A panel located on the right side of your screen. Our presenters will be responding to your questions throughout today's presentation. Thank you for your patience during these announcements. Presenting for us today, we have Ajay Kumar Singh, Senior R&D Solution Architect at Microsoft, and Harsh Birla, Senior R&D Solution Architect. Ajay, over to you to kick us off today.
Thanks, Sharon. Welcome to the session today. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining. As Erin mentioned, we have Harsh Birla, a Senior R&D Solution Architect, to help us in demo, as well as answering your questions. We also have Ankita Shangvi, who is the Engineering Manager in the Dynamics 365 platform teams, to help answer the questions. So today, as Erin mentioned, this session is all about the BatchRetryable framework that we introduced. So let's get started. BatchRetryable. So the agenda that we have today is the background. So why do we even have to think about the BatchRetryable? Then we have the BatchRetryable overview. So we'll be talking about overview of this feature. Then we'll be talking about how to achieve batch retrieval in any custom batch classes. Then we'll be also talking about how do I override if I have a batch class that has already been implemented for retrieval without making any code changes. Then we will have a quick demo and the behavior. What do we see with this batch retrieval framework when you implement in your batch classes? And the last but not the least is the key takeaway, what we take out from this session. So so the background. So Dynamics 365 finance and operation workload is typically a memory intensive and a SQL bound workloads that we have. So most of the transactions that we do in the 365 finance and operation is to fetch the data from the database, apply business process transformation, and then commit back to the database. So that's like each unit of work that we have is wrapped within a transaction block, which we call it out TTS begin and TTS commit, transaction begin and transaction commit. Now, so sometimes this unit of work might take longer to finish. And within that unit of work, if there is any connection loss happens, transient connection loss with the SQL server that happens, that is kind of resulting into the rollback of the work that we have already done and in the loss of work. And we get to, we kind of monitor from the telemetry and get a complaint from the customer and the partner saying that, hey, I have this particular process that failed. Now, these processes that we are talking about here at the unit of work can be initiated from a browser session by user by clicking a button on a form, or it could be an OData or service endpoint call to FNO, or it may be a batch process that triggering that unit of work or transactions. Now, when you see a SQL transient connection loss when you are in the browser and clicking a button, you get a message or info about connection loss and you do a refresh of the page and you can start again the process and you finish it. So that's kind of happens with the UI processes. However, when the process is in the batch and when the SQL transient connection failure happens, then your batch ends up with the error state. Now, what do we see as a symptom if there's any transient failure that happens with the SQL server on So one of the error message that normally you will see is that that you will see a message about connection may have been terminated by server. It's an ODBC driver issues. That's what you see sometimes in your browser or even in the info log for the batch jobs. Sometimes you also see cannot select a record on a table, a temporary problem with the database, please retry. So that's kind of error message that we see um, if, in case if there is a SQL connection failure happens. Now, what we need to kind of think about and ask a question is that why do I even go for a retrying and why do I even have a SQL connection issues? So the one thing that comes in right here is that Azure SQL database is offering us 99.99% availability for a zone redundant database in business critical tier. So all customer production environments are zone redundant and in business critical tier. So we are covered until 99.99% in terms of the SQL availability. So however, there is still 0.01% chances where SQL might not be available, and that could be because of an unplanned outages from the SQL side, which may be a failover, or DNS issues, or a planned outage from the SQL side. Maybe SQL is doing a patching and they're doing a failover to the other resources. There is maybe a resource constraint on the primary node, and the SQL is doing a failover to the secondary node. We might see a few millisecond or second connection losses that we call it transient connection loss with the database. So that's kind of one scenario where you will see SQL might not be available for 0.01%. So what we're talking about is this is not going to be a very frequent and the normal. It's 0.01% that we're talking here. For any SQL connection outages, we have a query that you can find out from your lifecycle services. If you go to the environment monitoring and activity tab, there's a query about fetching if there is any SQL outage, SQL Azure outage for that particular environment during that period. So you can find out if there is any. However, there are few error messages that you'll see either with the batch job or user processes that says the same signature about connection may have been terminated by server, but that's really not a SQL outage. Our watchdog, we call it as a watchdog. It's our auto healing and monitoring tool that we run against the database. And there may be a scenario where you initiated a process which is taking very long time to finish and it's creating a lot of blocking in the database. So example, you have a process which you just started and it's taking more than 4 hours to finish and it's creating a lot of blocking chain. And if we see that the lead blocker is sleeping for more than 4 hours, for us to make sure that other operations are going through, what we do is that by our auto monitoring and healing tool, we go back, we'll go and we might in some cases kill the lead blocker. And even if you do that, you'll see the similar behavior. So that's where I'm mentioning that if you suspect that a SQL connection failure happens, you need to verify that it's not a SQL outage. So one thing that we get is that what do we have? So if you just go back to since Q21, we had this transient SQL connection error exception that is kind of existed in D365 finance and operations since Q21. So there is a way for developer to write a code and write your own, retry logic, catch the exceptions, write a retry logic to retry if there is any SQL transient connection failure happen. That can happen for maybe a few seconds and milliseconds. So that's existed before, even before we introduced this retryable framework. Now, what is the challenge with that SQL transient SQL connection error exception that we had? So one thing that we have been seeing, looking at the telemetry and the complaints, is that the adoption for this transient SQL connection error has been it's very less adoption and uptake in the code. And again, there could be a valid reason behind it, because if you want to use this transient SQL connection error exception in your code, for you to be able to handle any SQL transient failures, you need to put in your own logic to catch that exception and then put in your own logic for the sleep, how long you want to retry, and how many times you want to retry. So that's kind of logic that you need to put in your code, and maybe that's one of the reason that adoption is we are not is not that high that we were thinking, and that's where we get a complaint about, hey, my bad job is in error stage and it's not finishing up, and some of the bad job that you'd see, it's a time sensitive bad job that needs to be finished within a time period. So this batch retryable framework that we introduced. So today in finance and operation, any bad job that you run, and if there's any SQL transient failure happen while batch job is executing, the batch will end up with an error stage, and you will have to manually come back and change the status to waiting for you to be able to run that batch again on a scheduled time in the request pattern. So that's kind of happens today. Now, to make out of finance and operation more resilient to this kind of SQL transient connection loss, we enable automatic restart with the batch job in case any transient failure happens from the SQL Server side. So for that, we introduced in 10.0.18 is retryable flag. So if this flag, what it does is that it's by implemented by the batch framework to determine whether I need to restart batch in case of any transient connection failure happens. So technically, if you mark your batch to be retried, and if there is it encounters any transient errors with the SQL Server, it will automatically retry. By default, all the batch jobs that you are creating or we have shipped is all set to false unless I'm implementing in my batch job. So it won't be retried if there's any transient failure happens. So what Microsoft is doing to converting the standard D365 finance and operation batch job. So we have done that in the phased manner. So you see here in 10.0.18 with 42 PU, we converted 75% of the standard batch job to start using this easy retryable framework. So 25% was left in the 10.0.18. In 19, we covered almost 98% of batch job to start using this framework. 2% are still left. Then what we are targeting is that, and also kind of hoping from the community and the customer and the partner, is to start adopting this framework in your custom batch classes. 2% you still see that by 10.0.22, we might still have 2% batch jobs which is not converted to retryable. And there is a reasoning behind it. So there are a few batch jobs which technically we cannot convert into retry, and the reason is the data inconsistency and a lot of other things. Example, sales invoice, right? You run a sales invoice batch job, which is doing an auto settlement against a payment from the credit card. And you have a batch task which is doing invoicing X number of sales order. And you had a SQL connection transient failure, and now the batch task is going to restart. It's going to invoice the sales order from start. And if that happens, you will end up charging your credit card double. So that we want to avoid this kind of scenario. Another example could be is that journal posting with auto settlement of the payment. We mark the invoices for payment, and the transient connection failure happens. We roll back the posting, but at the same time, we also want to make sure that the invoices that I marked for payment has been unmarked. So those are the 2% job that we won't be able to convert it to start using the retryable framework. Now, the next question that comes in is that how long you're going to retry and how many times. So if you have noticed in since 10.0.19, we are updating the max retry value to 5 for all batch tasks. So the default value is now 5. And the way we retry is that we retry after 5 seconds in increment of 5 seconds until 5 minutes. So we are retrying 5 times after 5 seconds, an increment of 5 seconds until 5 minutes. So example, if I have a failure right now, or transient connection failure right now, the batch will retry after 5 seconds, then 10 seconds, 15 until 5 minutes. So that's the one retry. And we have a maximum up to 5 retries. So totally, if I have a batch, if my SQL Server is not available today for maybe 20 minutes, still when the SQL is available, my batch is not going to end with the error, it's going to finish. Now, how to implement the retryable? So in 10.0.18, to start using the Retryable framework, we introduce a new interface, BatchRetryable. So this interface, BatchRetryable, has a method called isRetryable. And for us and for customer and partner to start using this framework, you need to implement that interface and set this method to true. And once you do that, then your batch class is registered for the retry. And now, so there is two scenarios. We have one for the RunBased Batch. So you two scenarios for the batch, right? So one is the RunBased Batch and one that you can use C++ framework. So for you to be able to start using BatchRetryable in the RunBased Batch, it's not a lot of code change that you need to do. So you are already extending to the RunBased Batch class. What you need to add is to implement retryables. That's the change that you need to do on your existing classes, or if you're writing a new class for the batch. The next thing that you do in the step 2 is to override that method isRetryable and set it to true. And once you do that, your class is registered for retrying. So in case of any SQL transient connection failure happens, your batch job is going to retry and restart. Pretty similar. You have to do it for the sys operation service controller batch classes that you are creating. Just same changes that you need to do is that we need to add and implement BatchRetryable and override the method isRetryable set to true. And then your class, your batch control, your main controller, or your class is kind of registered for retrying in case of any SQL connection failure that happens. Now, the question comes in is that we have configured, we have written a code for a batch to be registered for retry. Now, what happens if my batch is not behaving the way it's supposed to with the retry? Do I need to go and make a code change and remove that interface and set the method to false? And just to answer that question, we introduced a configuration form within system administration setup that is called batch class configuration override. So essentially, if you have registered a batch class to use the Retryable framework and you don't want that batch to be retried because of some reason and some issue that you encountered, you don't need to go back and make any code change. You just come back to this form, create a record for the class that you registered for the retry and uncheck this retryable. Once you do that and save the record, that particular class is not going to be retried in case any transient failure happens. So that's a configuration that we introduced to make sure that you don't need to go back and make a code change if there's any issue that you foresee with your batch classes. One thing to call out here is that this form is not designed for you to go and select a class and make it retryable by just checking this flag. That does not work. You can only filter the classes that is being registered using isRetryable method and your BatchRetryable interface. You can only see those classes and you can just uncheck it. If you can't make a class retryable by just selecting here and selecting isRetryable. You'll have to do in the code to register. However, you have an option that without any making code change, you can unregister. So that's the functionality this form is providing. Now, in terms of behavior, so what do we see if my batch job or my batch class is not registered for retryable? So example, you have a batch job where you are not implementing the BatchRetryable framework, or maybe you implemented it, but you set the method to false. And when any transient connection failure that happens, you'll see an error message that we have kind of highlighted in info log that cannot execute the required database operation. There is a temporary problem, and the batch ends with an error state. And now you have to come back and change the status to waiting for batch to execute on the next cycle. That's kind of behavior that we see for the batches. And then if you implement the BatchRetryable framework, and then if the similar thing happens, like you have a SQL transient connection failure, you will still see that error message log that cannot execute the database operation. There is a temporary problem. However, on the bottom, you see a new info log that we are adding is that if the retry happens because of the retry framework that has been implemented, and you'll see the batch is finishing up whenever the SQL is available. After a few milliseconds, after seconds, we keep trying it, and the batch finishes with the ended status, or it go back to the waiting status that normally it goes back. And now I'll hand over to the Harsh for a quick demo of this feature. Harsh, over to you.
Thanks, Ajay. So I'll quickly share my screen so we can actually have a look at the demo. So hello everyone, my name is Harsh Birla. I work with Microsoft Fast Track team as R&D Solutions Architect. So I'll be demoing the behavior of batch jobs, right, with retryable feature. So I would like to cover three scenarios. Basically, first is batch job behavior without batch retryable feature. The second one would be batch of behavior with BatchRetryable feature so that you can experience how does it work. And third thing is use of batch class override configuration setup that Ajay talked about, right? In case of if you need to unregister your batch class not to participate in batch retryable feature in batch retryable manner, then you know how you can actually use this configuration. So what I have is for my first scenario, a batch of behavior without batch retriable feature. So it's a very simple class, right, which extends from RunBased Batch. I have not implemented basically batch retriable here. It's simple code pattern for any kind of batch job where you will override the run method. And what I'm doing basically here is inserting the records, right, in a sample or custom table, right? So basically, it's a try catch block where and then TTS begin commit where I'm trying to insert a record in my custom table, right? There is no exception. It's commented, right? There is no exception to handle transient SQL connection error. So pretty much like how the legacy batch jobs have been designed, right? You can have the similar batch class extending from sys service controller, basically sys operation service controller as well, right? So in both the scenarios, the experience is pretty much same without batch retriable feature, right? So let me actually schedule this and see how does it work, right? So we can take a look, right? So going back to FNO, so this is my sample table. There is no data in here, and I will be actually setting up my batch job, custom batch job with no retry, right? There is no retry in the code. So trying to basically set up this batch job. Let me run it in a batch and submit it, right? Now my batch job is submitted. Let's take a look at the batch job inquiry. So you see the batch job is executing and it should have created records. Now I need to mimic the SQL transient error, right? So what I'm going to do in my tier 1 or cloud hosted environment is I'm going to stop my SQL Server service, right? So so let me do that. So what happens from interactive session perspective, right? So if I refresh my screen, it will not respond back, right? Because there is SQL transient issue right now. SQL Server is not available, so this from an interactive session perspective, it will not respond back, right? So this is what can happen in 0.01% scenarios where you may experience few milliseconds or kind of few seconds SQL transient issue, right? So what I'm going to do now is I have stopped it. So let me restart the service so it actually comes back. What will happen in this scenario is basically now my batch job is not marked for retriable, right? So there is SQL connection loss, and what happens is my batch job will also stop the processing of my logic, right? So basically now I have restarted the SQL. You notice there were only 2 records inserted that point in time, and let's refresh the batch screen to see how the batch job behaves. Let me refresh other screens as well. So if I go and again filter my batch job, so you notice that this batch job ended as in error state, right? So if you look at the history and look at the task, right, it ended with error. And if you look at the log, right, it will give you, hey, I was able to process 1, 2 records, but it was not able to commit the third one. And then there was a connection loss, right, from SQL perspective, and the batch task failed, right? So in typical production scenario, right, you may experience your batch task failed, and then once the connection resumes, there is no way it will retry the processing, right? Uh, so now this is kind of existing behavior without batch retrieval, right? So let me actually delete the record and then try to set up, try to show you another batch job where I have actually implemented the BatchRetryable interface. So it's pretty simple, the same class, but what I have implemented is BatchRetryable interface here. And I have overridden the isRetryable method, which returns true. That means this class is now marked for retryable, right? So if there is any SQL transient connection issue, it will retry, as Ajay mentioned, based on certain frequency and certain interval, right? Logic is pretty much same, right? I'm inserting the records and updating the records in my custom table, and there is no catch for SQL transient connection error, right? There is no catch that I'm actually catching this particular exception. So I've deleted the records. Let me actually schedule this batch. And this is my second batch job. So let's try to see the behavior, right? So we'll mimic the similar behavior. So my batch job is now scheduled. Let me go back to inquiries and filter for my second batch. So this is currently executing. If you notice, right, let's see, it should insert the records. Yeah, so it is creating the records, currently executing. Now, let's assume there is a transient connection issue with SQL Server. So I'll stop my SQL Server service. So and if you notice the connection from an interactive user perspective, it will not respond. Currently, FNO is kind of not available. But what happens in the background is my batch job is it will not fail, right? Because I have registered my class for batch retryable. So it will keep retrying after certain intervals. And once the connection resumes, uh, then it will restart the processing of my batch job. So consider this scenario for production environment, right, where you have critical business processes running in a batch, right? Let's say overnight. Now with this feature, basically, you don't have to worry about in case of these SQL transient connection issues, which rarely happen in case of 0.01%, but there is a rare chance, right? So we just wanted to make sure, with cloud, we provide you, enough resilience from a batch job perspective, right? So let me actually go back and start the SQL Server service and refresh this screen once more. Similarly, I'll refresh my sessions. Right. So currently there were 2 records inserted. Now it will. Now I have also resumed this. So let's take a look at the batch process. So yeah. So batch process actually. Okay, so I have marked this class for override. So let me actually delete it. Apologies for this behavior. So let me delete it. Therefore, you see, right, since I have overridden this class, so it actually ended with error. Okay, so let me actually do it again for this particular process to make sure, we exhibit the right behavior. So again, I'm going to set up my class. This is my third execution. Now I have removed this class from override, and let's see the behavior. So this is currently executing, and it started inserting the records. What I'm going to do is basically stop the SQL Server service. And I can restart it because now it FNO, it's not able to communicate to database, so there is a connection loss issue. So now SQL service is restarted. I'm going to refresh my sessions. So for this time, the batch job should be in executing state, right? Because the batch retriable should actually kick in, and then right. So that's what we would expect. So currently this is executing. In case of SQL connection issue as well, it didn't actually end it with error, right? So and it will continue basically executing my logic. So you see it will continue inserting records basically in this table, right? Now, let it finish. And, I wanted to show you how the info log look like, because in info log also, you will notice that, in case of transient issue, we actually capture and show you, how does it look like, right? So let me go back to batch of history and show you the error log, or basically info log. So what happens was it actually started the processing. It was able to insert first record, but and then it actually hit a SQL transient issue. And then it actually restarted the batch processing, right? So one was updated and it actually inserted the remaining records, right? So that's how you can actually see from the info log perspective, the behavior. Now, the third scenario is how to use batch class override configuration, right? So in system admin, you will notice that a batch class configuration override setup is now available. So now my batch class is basically marked for retryable because we have implemented the interface and overridden the method. Now for certain reason, I don't want this batch class to be retryable, right? So what I'm going to do is you can actually do a lookup also, or you can actually type in your class name, right? So this is my class name, and as soon as I hover over, this is marked for is retryable. Now, if you try to save this record, it will give you an error. Hey, this class is already configured for batch retryable, right? So now you can only use this feature to mark it for unretried, right? To unregister this class basically for retryable, right? So I should basically disable or basically unselect this checkbox and save it. Now this record is saved. That means even though in the code my class is marked for batch retriable, but with this setup, it takes precedent, and my batch class, it won't be actually retrying. So what happens is, in this case, let me remove this record and again set up the same batch job. So in this scenario, what happens is basically it behaves the similar manner, right? You know, a kind of behavior where you will see you will notice that in case of SQL transient issue, the batch job will fail, right? So let me go back and select this history. So I was looking at the batch task history. Let me go back to inquiries and then filter for my batch. So currently it's executing. It should have started inserting the records as well. Okay, yeah, and I should basically mimic the SQL transient issue, stopping the service, and I'm not going to refresh the browser now. I will quickly restart my service and refresh my screen. So what happens in this case is basically it will basically error out my batch job, right? So you will notice it will not proceed or retry the executing the logic. It will actually fail. So quickly want to refresh my session and then show you the batch history. Right, so that's how you will notice, right? This one was executed today and it actually failed in an error, and behavior is pretty much same, right? That used to be previously, right? It actually encountered the SQL transient issue and failed. So that's what we wanted to cover. So basically, batch class configuration overrides, as I mentioned, right? You can use this only to unregister your class for batch retriable. You cannot actually come back again and mark this for retriable, right? It will actually throw you an error. So that's what I wanted to cover in the demo. Over to you, Ajay, back for the presentation.
Thanks, Harsh. Let me share my screen. So yeah, so let's get a look at the behavior. So one of the behavior that you might have noticed when Harsh was showing the demo is that when the error happens, right, in the SQL transient error happens and the batch job is restarting to process, it's going to restart from the beginning. So example, if you are inserting records in the table and after maybe 10 records, you had a SQL transient failure, and the batch task is going to restart from the beginning, and you need to make sure that your code is ready to handle so that the very first record that you have inserted is going to be updated and the new records is going to be inserted. So that's the kind of one behavior that we have for the retriable, and that's one consideration that you need to do it when you are changing your existing batch classes or you are adding a new batch class to implement this feature, that your code is refactored and ready to handle this kind of situations. If a custom batch job is designed to run in multi-threaded, you must implement the retryable interface to your main controller and task controller. So there's a two different combination that we have seen is that you implement batch retrieval on your main controller, you are not implementing at the task controller. What happens is that if there any transient failure happens when your tasks are executing, you'll see like out of 5 tasks that is running, maybe one of the tasks which is kind of fall in that transient failure time ends with the error. Other task will finish, and your main controller is going to finish because you implemented retry on the main controller, and controller didn't encounter that problem. The problem was encountered by the task. So you need to make sure that when you are implementing batch retriable, you need to make sure that you are implementing at the main controller and the task controller. Similarly, if you do that vice versa, so you implemented batch retriable on your task controller level, but you didn't do it at the main controller level. And if there's any SQL transient connection failure that happens, your task is going to retry because the task was executing and the SQL transient failure happened. The task is going to retry and going to finish. And your main controller class is also going to finish. However, there will be a scenario is that even before the task controller classes or the task were created, you are doing some pre-processing or doing some calculation before you even create the tasks and your main controller, and the SQL transient failure happens at that time, then your batch will end up with error stage because you did not implement batch retriable in your main controller class. So that's a kind of a variant that you need to make sure that when you are implementing, you implement on the main controller and the task controller. We have a little different behavior in the DMF batch when there any transient failure that happen. So example, if you are importing journals from a file, right? And when you submit that into a batch, and there's two steps that we have, right? One is that populating the staging from the file and then from the staging to the target. If there is any SQL transient failure that happens when the data is kind of moving from the file to the staging, your DMF batch job is going to end with the error. The retry is not happening, and there's a reason behind it because at that time you have an SSIS, which and D365 FNO and the database. So if that happens at that point of time, it's going to fail with an error message that you see in the info log that cannot execute a stored procedure. So there is a temporary problem with the database. However, if your staging is populated and now it's staging to target operation is going on, and if you have a SQL transient failure at that stage, then that framework is ready to handle that scenario, and you will see that it's retrying and finishing your import. As you can see here, it's kind of an align with what Harsh was explaining, that I was loading 1080 records, and then after 8 records were loaded, I had a SQL transient failure. And then the DMF retried that load again, and they updated the first 8 record, and the remaining 1070 record got inserted. So that's the kind of behavior that you see when the DMF loads are happening. The other thing is now in the previous slides we have seen that the DMF import, if they're like that increase your execution time for the data load. So in this example, you are doing a load of the 1080 data. Now you see here 8 records I'm updating and I'm inserting remaining records. So example, your DMF import is going to take 3 hours, and after 2 hours you had a SQL transient problem. Then it's going to start from the beginning, which means that it's going to take maybe this time 5 hours. Now, how do we explain to the customer as a customer? How do I check? Is it a slowness in the data load today, or is it because of the retry that happened because of the SQL transient issues? And you can see it from the execution history. As you can see here, there is a two staging to target operation that is happening. One is that when system started, and then I had a failure, and then the retry happened, and then we got the finish one. So you can see here in the one load, I have 2 staging to target, and that is because of the failure. That is kind of an explanation on the increased time in the data load. That's the behavior that we are seeing in the DMF. However, there is one thing that we have, even if that happens, and if you go to the execution log, you won't see any error that we are logging about any transient failure happen or any retry retry happen. DMF is not logging that error. That error only logs if it's a source to a staging. So that's the behavior on the DMF side. Now, in terms of do's and don'ts, so what we are kind of asking is that implement batch retrieval for all your custom batch jobs. Implement for the, again, as we talked about, right, you need to implement for the main controller and your task controller. If you do it vice versa, or if you miss in any point, you'll see the behavior that we already spoke about. Well, again, you implemented the batch retrieval and you encountered problem. You don't need to go and make a code change. You can disable from the batch configuration override form that Horst was showing in the demo. Analyze the code pattern to ensure that the data is consistency to avoid any runtime errors. So what we are saying is that we cannot go ahead and enable batch retry for all. If I've not refactored my code to handle a situation where you see that 8 records were inserted, then a SQL failure happened, and then it's updated the 8 record and inserted the remaining records. So if that kind of data code factoring I have not done, maybe we'll end up with the data inconsistency error because it's going to retry from the start. In don'ts, again, if you call an external service from an X++ logic or X++ batch class, and you are not maintaining any persistent state in the database of what information that you have already sent to the service call, you should not be considering that for the batch retriable. Example, if I'm writing into the messaging queue or service bus from X++, I'm not maintaining what I have already written in the service bus or messaging queue. And if the retry happens, I'll end up sending a duplicate messages. So those kind of classes, we are not recommending to go and implement the batch retriable. Now, so one question that frequently has been asked is that how do I test? How do I test the batch retriable in my standard jobs or my custom classes? So in CHE, cloud-hosted dev machines, which Harsh was already demoing, that you simply just run the batch and stop and start, and you can see it that your batch has been stopped and it's kind of restarted again. Can I test batch retriable in tier 2 or sandbox environment? Unfortunately not. You won't be able to test in the sandbox because you don't have that capability to stop or even do the failover of the database. Even if we try to do it, so all the database are part of an elastic pool. Any failover that happens is going to fail over the entire pool. So we are not going to affect the other databases in that pool. So you won't be able to test in tier 2 or sandboxes, but the symptoms and behavior are the same what you test in the tier 1 or your dev boxes. Changes need to be done at the task level. Why it's not possible to do at the batch framework level? So that's the question that we got in the Q&A panel as well, and we have been asking that why do I need to go back and make a code change to my batch job? Why don't you implement the batch framework itself and let all the batch job to be ready for retriable? And the answer is that we don't want to assume that all the code that you have written is going to handle the consistency problem if there is any restart or retry going to happen. So we don't want to do at the framework like again having an issue with the badges and data consistency with the custom classes that we are creating. That's where we have given this an option to implement by class level, where you know that my class or my batch is ready to handle the retry if there is any restart happens. So that's where we are not doing at the framework level. Does batch configuration override have any data? The form that Harsh was showing has any data when we do a new deployment of FNO, finance and operation? No, because all the classes that we have, like 98% classes that we have converted to start using Retryable framework, it's already been code has been refactored and it's ready to handle the scenario of retry. So I don't need to go and do any override here. So it's only going to be by if you have a badge that you converted and it's not behaving the way it's supposed to, then you go and create the record. We are not creating any record for the record there. Does BatchRetryable SQL handle the transient error, or is there any plan to handle other kind of an exceptions like deadlock, update conflict, etc.? SQL transient connection. This BatchRetryable is only for the SQL transient connection. You will have to continue doing your deadlock and update conflict exception that you are handling as of today. Any other failures? No, it's only for the SQL transient connection issues. A retryable increases the batch execution time. How do we handle for the standard batches? And I've already explained a bit about that. That if you have a scenario where the batch is failed after running an hour and it's going to restart from the scratch, which is going to increase the execution time of the batch. And if it's a DMF, you can see where the DMF execution log shows you the explanation that why it's taking longer. In case of the normal batch job and info log, you can go and see that that it says that there was a retry happens or there was a SQL connection failure happen and the retry happened, and that's where it's taking longer. Now we get to ask question about, hey, why do I need to do that? And it's increasing my my execution time. So it's not increasing your execution time. So example, you have to decide, right, whether you want the batch to be in the failed status tonight and next day morning you come and change the status to waiting, or you want system to handle that 0.01% cases if that happens to restart your batch so that when you come next day morning, maybe it's taking longer time, but it's finishing on. So that's the kind of decision that you have to take. Now, key takeaways. Again, educate your developers to start using this batch retryable feature. That's the takeaway that we want to take from and also implement batch retry for all your custom batch jobs as much as possible. Again, not all custom batch jobs, but as much as possible. We want to make sure that you implement retryable on the controller, main controller, and the task controller. And again, like we have mentioned earlier, that by default, or there is no framework level change that we have done that all custom batch job is going to handle the retry. You will have to implement in your class, batch class, to be able to use the retry in case of any SQL transient failure happen. Now, last but not the least, socialize this feature. Use LinkedIn, Twitter, and make sure that all communities, they're all aware, developers all know that, hey, we have a feature to be start considering when we're adding a new batch classes. And in terms of the documentations, so we have a documentation already published, and you can show some of the FAQs that we have talked about here. It's already documented there. That's all. That's all that I wanted to talk about in the batch retryable. Now handing over to Erin.
Excellent. Thank you so much, AJ and Harsh, for the presentation today. I already posted a link, but I'm going to post it again to a short survey in the Q&A panel. We would really appreciate your feedback. It'll only take a moment of your time. So again, if you guys can take that, we greatly appreciate it. Not only can you give us feedback on today's session, but you'll also be able to share what you'd like to see in future events. So thank you in advance. As a reminder, today's recording will be available on the Tech Talks Community Dynamics page within 5 business days. A big thank you again to Harsh and AJ and our moderators, and of course to the audience for joining us. We hope you have a wonderful day wherever you may be. See you soon.